everybody, it's Tanya and welcome to today's video. This video is going to be a book recommendation video, but not from me, from Italo Calvino. So if you remember, a few weeks back I made a video why read the classics. If you haven't seen that, I will link it up here if you're interested. That video was based on an essay by Italo Calvino from this book. This book is a collection of his essays on classics, and as the title suggests, why we should read the classics. The very first essay here is his essay why we should read the classics, and the rest of the essays are essays on different classics from different time periods, from different countries, what he thought of them, what he liked about them, what he found interesting about them. That first video was reasons to read the classics, and this video is going to be because he has a lot of essays here, so I'm going to split it into two videos. So today's video is going to be ancient, medieval, and some Renaissance classics that he recommends, and then the second part is going to be about the classics from the 19th and the 20th century, because there are a lot of classics from that time period. So yeah, today we're going to talk about earlier classics that he recommends. With no further ado, let's begin. And the first book that is featured here is of course The Odyssey by Homer. The theme that interests Calvino the most in this book is the theme of memory and what role memory plays in this story. So I have a quote for you from his essay. He says, "What Ulysses saves from the power of the lotus, from Circe's drugs, and from the siren's song is not just the past or the future. Memory truly counts for an individual, a society, a culture. Only if it holds together the imprint of the past and the plan for the future, if it allows one to do things without forgetting what one wants to do, and to become without ceasing to be without ceasing to become." In terms of memory, he compares the Odyssey to mythological and fairy tale, folk tale traditions of other countries. He says that in those traditions, every enterprise that restores justice, restores order, restores the ideal kind of situation, that ideal situation, that order and justice belong to the past. So the desirability of the future always depends on how close this future is to the past. And in this aspect, memory of the past and memory of how things used to be, it plays important part in that, because memory is what preserves that past. Memory is what reminds people of how things should be. So the desirable kind of outcome is always in the past and never is in the future in this fairy tale and mythological tradition. But he also points out that the Odyssey is actually quite modern for its time, and it has some new elements to the character of the Odysseus, because before the main characters had to be this a hero, this epic poetry hero, a paradigm of aristocratic military virtues. Ulysses is all of that, but he also is a man who has suffered and who has been through horrendous experiences threatening his life, a man who loses everything and who has to fight for what belongs to him, for what is his. And so this new element of going through difficulties and suffering and going through poorhood and labors is what creates this understanding that being poor, laboring, going through harsh experiences is an unfair situation. Later on it becomes connected in like social mind to injustice. It becomes connected to the idea of rights being trampled on. And even if you look at later fairy tales that come later in other cultures, you'll often see these two kind of storylines, when either a poor person becomes rich, so goes from dirt to riches, or an initially rich person loses everything but then returns back to riches. So the idea of being poor and laboring and struggling becomes an idea of injustice that needs to be put right. And then later on we will see this idea becoming a fundamental point for the whole social conscience, starting from the French Revolution. And Ulysses was the first book to come up with this idea and to create this idea and to justify it. So that's what he thought about Ulysses, and I thought it was interesting. So how certain ideas from the book later on are represented in like actual life historical events. So that was fun. And also I really like his idea about memory and what part memory plays in this story. The second book that Italo Calvino convinced me to pick up, because before I never considered reading historical accounts. Like I never even thought of picking up a text by a historian, like an actual non-fiction text. I always thought that they would be dry. I kind of considered them to be, you know, not interesting, because I compared them with 3 textbooks, and I know for myself, like whenever I read a history textbook, I never remember anything from them. Never. It's just because there's usually so dry, and there's like so many facts in them, and I just get overwhelmed, and I never remember anything from history textbooks. And so I didn't even consider reading historical texts. However, in this collection of essays, he talks about Anabasis by Xenophon. I think, if I'm not mistaken, in Penguin edition, the book is called The Persian Expedition, and in Oxford Classics edition, the book is called The Expedition of Cyrus by Xenophon. The way he talks about this book in his essay makes me so incredibly interested, and I really want to pick this book up. And after reading also the Iliad, the Odyssey, and considering this, I decided I also want to read Herodotus' histories. So yeah, Italo Calvino, it's all him. He got me interested in historical works. But basically what he says about Persian expedition, I will call it that because I'm not sure how to pronounce, is it Anabasis? I don't know. So what he says about his experience reading this work, he says, reading Xenophon's Anabasis today is the nearest thing to watching an old war documentary, which is repeated every so often on television or on video. It's difficult to quote from Xenophon. What really counts is the never-ending succession of visual details and action. It is difficult to locate a passage which epitomizes entirely the pleasing variety of the text. It says that the subject matter of the Persian expedition would perfectly suit for a picaresque novel or for a mockery heroic tale, because the plot, not the plot, but like what the book is about a Greek army which was hired by a Persian prince, Cyrus, to fight for him against his relative, like kind of for his throne. However, they lose the fight. And now, after the war, they have to return 10,000 of them. 10,000 of Greeks have to return back to Greece. And they are far away from home. They are on a foreign, hostile land. They don't have any food. They don't have anything on them. And of course, they constantly represent a threat to the local population because there's 10,000 of them. 10,000, an army. And they're marching back home, and they're hungry, and they're dirty. Of course, when they come across a settlement, they bring it to the ground and they rob it. And there is like an endless amount of women following the army back to Greece as well. And they destroy the land like a swarm of locusts. And of course, nobody is eager to help them. And Italo Calvino points out that Xenophon is not really interested in portraying the story in this like epic, poetic way. The book is written in the form of a military officer logbook. It's like his diary. He also criticizes other commanders of the army and their decisions. It is also very rich on describing combat. And Italo Calvino says that Xenophon is really good at it. There is also a pathos in the story because of course the army wants to get back home and they are worried about being so far from home. They're nervous, they're anxious, they want to meet their families again, they want to be on their ground again. But there is also a moral side to this book because Xenophon doesn't idealize himself or his army and what they are doing. He is perfectly aware of the fact that he is the head of a bunch of barbarians. He is the head of a swarm of locusts who just ravage the place they come to. He is perfectly aware of the fact, and he tells to his soldiers that you should always be prepared because local population can come and rob us. And they will have a perfectly good reason to do that because we are on their land, not they are on ours, we are on theirs. So he perfectly understands his position and he talks about it openly. The biggest part that Italo Calvino praises about the Persian expedition or the expedition of Cyrus or the Anabasis is its visual descriptions of the nature, descriptions of customs of the land that they find themselves in, descriptions of their struggles. Like everything is very visual, and he says that it makes you feel like you're there. So he gives this passage, for example, of Greeks kind of struggling with cold, trying to warm themselves up. So some Greeks who have moved away from the camp reported having seen in the distance what looked like a massive army and many fires lit in the night. When they heard this, the commanders thought it unsafe to remain in separate quarters and once more made the soldiers regroup. The soldiers then all camped together again, especially as the weather seemed to be improving. But unfortunately, during the night, so much snow fell that it covered the men's armor, the animals, and the men themselves, huddled on the ground. The animals' limbs were so stiff with the cold that they couldn't stand up. The men delayed before standing up because the unmelted snow lying on their bodies was a source of heat. Then Xenophon bravely got up, stripped, and started to chop wood with an axe. Seeing his example, one of the men got up, took the axe from his hand, and continued with the chopping. Others got up and lit a fire, and all of them greased their bodies, not with oil, but with a substance found in the local village, an oil made from sesame seed, bitter almonds, and turpentine and lard. There was also a perfumed oil made of the same substances. And he also points out that obviously army constantly faces certain difficulties and comes across multiple obstacles, and these obstacles are always overcome by Xenophon's cunning. So yeah, the man didn't forget himself. He didn't forget himself. So that's going to be also interesting to read. So yeah, I'm he got me really interested in like Anabasis and like this Persian expedition. So that's the book that I definitely want to read for myself. The next book Italo Calvino recommends in this collection of essays is Metamorphoses by Ovid. And from Metamorphoses he gives this one quote: "In the high heavens there is a roadway which can be seen when the sky is clear. It is called Milky Way, and it's famous for its whiteness. Here the gods pass by on their way to the palace of the great Thunderer. On the right and left sides of the road, with their doors open, stand the entrance halls of the nobler gods, always filled with crowds. The more plebeian deities live scattered about elsewhere. The more powerful and famous gods have settled their own household gods here, giving directly onto the road. If the comparison didn't seem irreverent, I would say that this place is the Palatine area of the mighty heavens." And so after giving this quote, Italo Calvino talks about what he likes most about Metamorphoses and what he finds the most interesting, and that is the world. In this particular essay, he talks a lot about the world and the poetry of the world. He says that Ovid in Metamorphoses shows the world where the borders between the gods, humans, and nature are blurred. The contiguity between the world of the gods and the world of the humans is the most prominent topic in the Metamorphoses, and the poetry of the work is in the interpenetration of these three worlds: world of gods, world of people, and world of nature. And this contiguity of three levels implies not a hierarchical order, but more of a system of interrelations in which every level can influence other two levels to different extents. Another point that he makes about Metamorphoses is how it borrowed certain writing techniques from different cultures around Roman Empire of that time. As an example, he gives the borrowing from the Orient culture, borrows the technique of widening the space within the novel through including stories within stories. So the most obvious example would be the Arabian Nights, of course, which of course were written after the Metamorphoses, but the technique itself was present in the Orient literature before that, during the time of Roman Empire as well. So that's what you can also see in Metamorphoses, what Ovid borrowed from Orient literature. Next book that Italo Calvino thinks would make a fascinating read and that he found interesting is the Natural History by Pliny the Elder. This is a very ambitious work that ranges from astronomy to art and from geography to zoology. It mingles acute observations with often absolutely wild speculations about nature, and it gives you an interesting perspective and an interesting view on the world from the perspective and from how it was understood by people in the 1st century AD Roman Empire. Pliny himself died during the volcanic eruption that destroyed Pompeii in 79 AD. Some people suggest that he was investigating and studying the eruption itself, and other people suggest that he was actually saving his friends from the city. Either way, he died during that eruption. Italo Calvino's recommendations for this book. So what he says: for sheer pleasure of reading, I would advise anyone taking up Pliny the Elder's Natural History to focus mainly on 3 books. The 2 containing the fundamentals of his philosophy, that is to say Book 2 on cosmology and Book 7 on man. And for an example of his unique blend of erudition and fantasy, Book 8 on land animals. He also said that in his opinion, people don't really read Pliny, they consult with him to learn how people viewed the world back then, and sometimes to find some interesting facts and bizarre observations of nature of that time. He says that the good point about Pliny is that the man was very careful not to put anything from himself. He would closely write whatever sources of his time talked about the topic that he was writing about. So you don't really read a book by Pliny. It's not his pure opinion. It's the opinion of kind of the academic, not academic, but you know, the kind of scientific philosophical community of his time. So that's very interesting. It's not just his opinion, it's actually the opinion of this kind of the, you know, learned circles of his time. He always sticks to the facts, or what he thought to be the facts. So that's the interesting part about Pliny. Next, early classic, which I was so excited to see on the list. I've never heard about it before, but you will see why I got so excited, is Haft-Peykar by Nazami. That's a piece of Persian classic literature. So Haft-Peykar, word for word translation, is 7 fights. I asked my husband, he says that Peykar is a fight, but then when I read like on the internet, they said that Peykar is a portrait. I don't know, so whatever. The English name is Seven Princesses, a romantic epic actually, written by a Persian poet Nazami in 1197. The poem is classified as erotic literature, but it also has a strong moralistic side to it. The plot of the poem is that there is this prince, Bahram, who, similarly to many European fairy tales, but in European fairy tales, princes only like see one portrait of one lady and fall in love with her. In case of Prince Bahram, he sees 7 portraits of 7 ladies and he decides to marry all of them. So he sends his representatives to 7 lands where these 7 princesses live, and yeah, he offers them his heart and his hand, and so eventually he marries all 7 of them. And then he builds this palace with like 7 kind of rooms for each princess, and then for each day of the week he visits one princess and he enjoys times with her, he enjoys kind of her favors, conversation, and similarly to 1001 Night, this like, you know, this Orient tradition, what do you think princes do? They tell him stories. So for the 7 days of the week, he will listen to 7 different stories from these princesses, and that's basically like the plot of the poem. And each of these stories has a moral conclusion to it, so that's why the book is not only like an erotical literature, which, you know, prince obviously enjoys certain favors from the princesses, but it also has a strong moral side to it, which you will find in the stories that the princesses tell him. As all Persian literature of that time, the book is very heavy on metaphors, and Italo Calvino also mentions this in his essay, that it's very rich in metaphorical descriptions. And that's an interesting thing about it, because there is this epic Shahnameh. If you haven't heard, it's translated as the Book of King or the Persian Book of Kings by the poet Ferdowsi. I really want to read that one. It's also an epic poem. It's famous because it is the poem. Ferdowsi is the poet who saved the Persian language from extinction, because when he wrote that poem, I think it was 11th century, at that time the Persian land was occupied by the Arabs, and they were forcing people to use the Arabic language for life, for like business things, in writing. They were enforcing Arabic language on the land, and Persian language was about to be extinct. However, Ferdowsi, who lived on the territory of, I think it was modern Uzbekistan, I think, and that territory wasn't as heavily monitored by the Arabs. So that's why he was able to write his epic in Farsi, in the Persian language. Shahnameh is also the longest epic poem written by a single person. So I'm really interested in reading that one, as well as Haft Peykar, so the Seven Princesses, that Italo Calvino is recommending. But I talked to my husband and I asked him, like, did you read it in school? He said, like, yeah, they read it in school. And I'm like, do you recommend me? Should I read it? And he's like, it's really hard because it is really heavy on metaphor. It's very heavy on metaphor, and like, it's going to be hard for you to understand what he is referring to, what he is talking about. So that's kind of intimidating me. But at the same time, I think that in an English translation, there would be footnotes, there would be notes, right? And another part why it's difficult, he says, is that because it's written in like old Farsi. So in school they read it in old Farsi. I think maybe it's similar to Dante Alighieri's kind of Divine Comedy, right? So that's why it was hard for him. But then in English, I think if it's translation, it would be translated into modern English with footnotes, right? So maybe it wouldn't be that hard. So yeah, I really want to try Shahnameh one day, and I was really happy to see Seven Princesses on Italo Calvino's list. I haven't heard of this poem before, but yeah, Italo Calvino introduced me again. So yeah, that's another kind of epic that I want to read, and it's from Persian literature. Wonderful. One more book that Italo Calvino recommends is Tyrant Le Blanc. So in the English it can be translated as Tyrant the White. It's one of the first Spanish chivalric novels, and it was written by a Valencian knight, and it was first published in 1490. Tyrant the White is the name of the protagonist of the novel, a knight who saves the Byzantine Empire. I couldn't find an English translation of this work, so maybe you will find it, but I will insert, I guess, picture of maybe Spanish version then. It is considered to be a masterpiece of Valencian literature and the Catalan language, and it influenced the evolution of European literature through its influence on Miguel Cervantes. Italo Calvino points out this in his essay, that when you read Don Quixote, those of you who have read, do you remember the scene where the priest and the niece and the housekeeper of Don Quixote, where they're burning his library? You will remember that they don't burn all the books. There are a few books that they save, and Tyrant Le Blanc, Tyrant the White, is one of those books. And what the priest says about it. So it is said that the book is literally original, and it shows a human truth. So their knights eat, sleep, and die in their beds, and make a will before they die, along with all the things which find no place in other books of this kind. And so it shows that Cervantes respects chivalric works the more they contravene the rules of the genre. So the more realistic they are, the more truthful to life they are, the more essential they are from the point of view of Cervantes. And that's also what Italo Calvino points out about this work, how influential it is, but also how important it is in terms of its being truthful to life. So Tyrant the White is another book that Italo Calvino recommends for your reading. One more epic poem that Italo Calvino suggests for your reading is Orlando Furioso by Ludovico Ariosto. This is an Italian epic poem, And Italo Calvino says that this is a book that refuses to start and refuses to end. He says it because Ludovico Ariosto announced this book as a continuation of another novel. And at the same time, he never finished working on it. After the first tome was published, he continued working on the second tome, which was never finished because the author died. So that's why Italo Calvino says that it's the work that refuses to start and refuses to begin. At the same time, he points out that whenever people introduce Orlando Furioso, they always tend to mention that it's a continuation of another novel, which plays to disadvantage of the book actually. Because it turns the reader down, because the reader thinks, okay, so now I have to read another book prior to reading Orlando Furioso. And Italo Calvino says that no. He thinks that this book, Orlando Furioso, must be read separately, and it must be considered a work on its own, not a continuation of another author's work. It's a full, as he says, it's a universe on its own. So what he says, his words are, the Furioso is a book unique in its genre and can, or perhaps I should say must, be read without reference to any other text that either precedes or follows it. It's a self-contained universe across whose length and breadth the reader can roam, entering, getting lost. The book is set in times of Holy Roman Empire, and it's a story of love, adventures, magical adventures as well. Count Orlando, the main character, he returns from France after a certain campaign, and as his prize he brings this beautiful girl Angelica. But his cousin Rinaldo falls in love with Angelica, and he challenges Orlando for a duel. During the duel, Angelica escapes on a horseback. She doesn't want to be with any of the men. She just jumps on the horseback and escapes from both of them while they're fighting. And it is said that the epic poem is a dazzling kaleidoscope of fabulous adventures, sorcery, and romance. And it has intrigued generations of writers, including Spenser and Shakespeare, with its depiction of fantastical worlds, of magic rings, flying horses, sinister wizardry, and barbaric splendor. So it sounds like a wild ride. I definitely want to try and read it one day. I found, like, in Oxford edition it's just one book, but then Penguin edition gives you both parts, the first and the second part. So interesting. Italo Calvino got me interested in Orlando Furioso. The next book is The Book of My Life by Girolamo Cardano, an Italian Renaissance scholar. Italo Calvino talks about him because the person is just an extraordinary person who had quite a life and who had quite a personality. And in his late life, he was condemned by the Inquisition to house arrest. And during that house arrest, he wrote this book, The Book of My Life. I say that he was quite a person because, first of all, he was a scholar, so he was widely known in Europe, first of all, as a medic, as a doctor, but he was also interested in all kind of sides of science, astrology, as well as natural philosopher. He was also very preoccupied with himself. In the Renaissance, Italo Calvino says that he was considered kinda as a magician, and he even encouraged this belief within the society. He was also very much preoccupied with himself and his health. So that's why in this book, it's not exactly his like autobiographical account of like his day-to-day life. It's like it's split into chapters, and so some chapters deal with his childhood memories. For example, what he saw as a child. He was Italo Calvino says that he was describing kind of certain beings that he saw as a child that were consisting of like rings, and whenever his mother would ask him, what are you looking at, he didn't say anything because he was afraid that these beings would be annoyed if he talked about them to his mother, and so he never told her what he was seeing. Like he was just seeing things as a child. And then some other chapters would be dedicated to his health, for example, because he was very much concerned with his health. So he would like he very in very much detail he described his like own physical problems. And some other chapters would be dedicated to his like adventures and exploits, because he was also a gambler. He liked playing cards and dice, and once he had to escape his creditors, I think. So, and like there was like a fight with swords and stuff like that. So he had quite an adventurous experiences. And then some other chapters would be dedicated to him losing his son, because his son was executed for killing, for murder, and so he would also talk about that experience in this book. So yeah, the book of my life, it's not a like traditional autobiography in a traditional understanding of the world, but it's an interesting self-portrait of a Renaissance person written by himself. So that also got me interested in this book. So yeah, the book of my life. And the last book that I want to talk to you about today that Italo Calvino recommends is Jacques the Fatalist by Denis Diderot. So what he says: Diderot's status amongst the founding fathers of contemporary literature is continually rising, and mostly because of his anti-novel or meta-novel or hyper-novel, Jacques the Fatalist, and his master. The text's richness and innovative thrust will never be fully exhausted. He says that unlike authors of his time, whose main concern was to make the reader feel like he is participating in the story, like make reader forget that he is reading a book, and make him feel like the events of the book are unfolding in front of his eyes. Unlike those writers, Diderot is playing with reader. He plays this game of cat and mouse, and he opens the endless possibilities in front of the reader, and then he closes all of them except for one, and that one is always the least novelistic development. In this respect, Diderot is a forerunner of the idea of potential literature. Italo Calvino also points out the influences on Diderot. Two of the main influences are Tristram Shandy by Sterne, and critics of Diderot's time, they also noticed how similar Jacques the Fatalist was to Tristram Shandy, and Diderot, in order to show how little he cared for the claims of plagiarism, in the end of the novel he puts the sentence. He actually declares before one of the final scenes in the book that he has copied it from Tristram Shandy. Another influence on Diderot was, not surprisingly, because Jacques the Fatalist is a book about two characters traveling on horseback and participating in various adventures and telling each other different stories. Which book does this remind you of? It should remind you of Don Quixote. So yes, Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes was another influence on Diderot. And Italo Calvino also points out that Diderot is actually a feminist writer, because for him, and you can clearly see it in the novel, that For him, women are on the same spiritual level as men. They are on the same moral and intellectual level with men, and they're equally entitled to search for their happiness as men. So that also makes him an author worth reading. Diderot and his Jacques the Fatalist is the last book that I wanted to talk to you about today. Then in the second part of the video I will be talking to you about novels from the 19th century and the 20th century that Italo Calvino recommends and found interesting and important. I hope you're excited for that second part as well. And for now, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope it was interesting. Hopefully you found some interesting books you would like to check out for yourself, and yeah, hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good day, have a good time. I hope you're reading good books and enjoying them, and I will see you soon in my next videos. Thank you very much for watching. Bye.